Good afternoon, everybody. 4 o'clock and 60 minutes between now and time beer gets served, I think. So it's very important we use our time wisely here. And to help do that, we've got an illustrious panel which is going to introduce themselves in the next few minutes. But first, I wanted to give you a little introduction, a little 2-minute intro into the Ultra HD Forum, which was conceived at CES and born at NAB, and really kind of came out in force at IBC this year. 38 organizations and 2 more joined this week. It's growing all the time. You see a nice wide grouping of operators. There are people who have technology provision. There's some room in our folds for startups as well. And it's becoming a very vibrant organization. And it's there for the advocacy of end-to-end solutions in the TV and media delivery of Ultra HD. And people ask all the time about what's the difference between us and the UHD Alliance, which came out at IBC, which is a much smaller group of companies, and their focus is very much on the origination point and on the display point. There is a lot in between, as we all know, and that's what we're focused on. And we are preparing guidelines that give best industry practices, because there's so many different options still outstanding, so many loose ends. We'll come to those loose ends as we start with this panel. So at the end of this, I will tell you a little bit more about what we're doing later this year and into next year. But it's an interesting organization that is really starting to get some real momentum now. With that, I'd like to introduce to Richard Daugherty, that's from Dolby, and I'm going to hand the baton to you to take you through the slides.
Hi, I'm Richard Daugherty from Dolby, and I just had they just had to ask me to do a very fast introduction. But Dolby's very excited about Ultra HD, and I'm sure you guys have seen some of that going forward. We've always had this belief that there's kind of 3 cornerstones to next generation video. The first is you can have more, what you do with pixels. First, you can have more pixels. Probably many of you have heard this. I see some people nodding. I know friends over there. You can have more pixels, and if you just increase the number of pixels, that's a better picture. You're going to 4K is a typical way to do that. Faster pixels, we increase frame rates, and a number of people have experimented with that. You've seen some cinema experiments as well, but definitely over the top. Lots of people doing 60 frames per second kinds of material. Or better pixels, which I think is more the topic of this panel, is there are things you can do to make the pixels actually better. You can have a higher dynamic range or a wider color gamut. And these kinds of changes to pixels really give you an image that's significantly better. We haven't changed dynamic range and color palette in broadcast for 45 to 50 years. So we keep increasing the number of pixels, but we haven't been looking at color depth, and so now's the time to do it. And we're getting a lot of bang for our buck with that. Dolby Vision is the one my company provides, working through from end to end, and we are doing larger color gamuts, including moving to Rec 2020, larger dynamic ranges, getting contrast ratios up to 2 million to 1. And we have some OTT services that are already looking at that. Voodoo has announced one for Dolby Vision. There's some movie streaming, and this is 12-bit, high dynamic range, Rec 2020 color gamut movies are actually streaming over the top now. So we're kind of excited about the service. And there's another movie you guys may have heard of coming next month. This indie film that has light somethings, and that's going to show in Dolby Vision in cinema. We've done a number of cinema releases, but we're really proud of this one coming up. It was announced just a couple days ago, and you can see that in Burbank or in the Disney Theater. Anyway, high dynamic range, next generation, we're very excited.
Okay, with that, we'd like to hand over to Thomas. It was from Fox. By the way, you notice that the actual dynamic range on this projector is pretty limited. What you just saw there was nothing like you're going to see in the movies. Anyway, Thomas, over to you.
Okay, very good. So again, I'm with Fox. I'm actually with Network Engineering and Operations, which is the distribution arm of the broadcast and the cable networks. However, I live on the Fox lot, and across the way is 20th Century Fox, who make these beautiful feature films, and they're very excited about ultra high definition over at 20th Century Fox. They're so excited about it that almost every new movie that comes out of 20th Century Fox will have a UHD version. And when I say UHD, I mean the whole kit and caboodle. 4K resolution, high dynamic range, wide color gamut. And these movies will be made available through Ultra HD Blu-ray, the packaged media, which you'll be seeing showing up around Christmas time, and also through the Avidity download capability, which will be offered through mgo.com for Fox to begin with, and there may be some other providers later. Avidity is a secure file download mechanism. So it's not live streaming, and the reason why Fox chose this was because we don't think the average internet bandwidth for the US right now is capable of live streaming the quality of 4K high dynamic range wide color gamut that 20th Century Fox believes that their high quality feature films deserve. They think it's upwards of 30 megabits per second in HEVC coding to have the quality required for UHD. So these are going to be, so you're able to download these to your television and then play them back on your television, for instance. Looking at the internet bandwidth in the US, I suspect maybe by about the year 2018 to 2020, we'll see the average American able to reach those bit rates. So it is coming in terms of very high quality live streaming. It's not quite there yet. I want to talk a bit about what 4K resolution really means, and this is the rule of thumb developed by a famous man by the name of Andy Setos, who used to be president of technology at Fox. Can I have a volunteer from the audience? Quick, someone raise your hand. Okay, you, please. Can you stand up? Stand up, please. Okay. I need you to hold out your arm like this, and with your thumb up. And right now, so is your thumb now bigger than that screen or smaller? The screen up there, the big screen. Is it bigger or smaller? If it's bigger, I need you to get closer to the screen.
We need to take a picture of this. Everyone's giving us all thumbs
Can you walk?
up. It's great.
About the same. About the same?
Oh,
Okay,
right
then
distance.
you are approximately 3 picture heights away from that screen. That is the distance that you need to be at in order to see high definition resolution. That's 1080 lines of resolution. Anyone who is behind her cannot see high definition resolution on that screen unless you have pretty freaky eyes, okay? So just to be clear, only the front row here is really getting high, maybe the second row over there is getting high definition resolution. So for 4K, you need 2 thumbs. You need to go like that. And that will subtend the angle required for you to be close enough to the screen to see 4K or 2160p resolution. So this is one of the challenges that most of the television sets which are being sold right now, which are 4K sets, you actually have to get pretty close to them to see the 4K resolution. So my personal viewpoint on this is that as we get to televisions which are 80, 90, 100 inches, we're going to see some awesome 4K. But when we're down below 70 inches, most people are not going to be sitting close enough to their screen to really see the full 4K experience. So I see it as a forward-looking technology.
Thank you. So let's go back. But there is one of the founders of the Ultra HD Forum was New Line, along with Ericsson and others. And Eric Grab is the co-CTO, whatever that means.
Whatever that means. Yeah, so I'm Eric Grab, co-CTO at New Line. I'm also the board member on the Ultra HD Forum and chair of the working group for interoperability there. New Line has a really powerful and comprehensive platform for doing live sports through the internet. And it does pretty much the whole end-to-end thing that you'd want to do. So we power some very noticeable brands such as UFC, NFL, NBA, and also World Surf League, and really letting up-and-coming sports be able to access the power of the internet. We also have a lot of core technology. The brand Divx for consumer electronics is actually part of New Line, and also a lot of people here in the industry will probably recognize the brand Main Concept, which has some of the best encoders and decoders and packaging for dealing with that. So that's quickly about New Line and myself. And one of the things on the Ultra HD Forum is we see there's a lot of challenges in the marketplace for really accelerating Ultra HD. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And that's a big debate, I think, in the industry. And I think some of the activities that we're doing in the forum and what's going on is to help accelerate that in Ultra HD, because it does, Ultra HD is a great quality experience, but also making sure it's out there, it's accessible, and that you really have a great interactive experience. So we're looking forward to the increases in quality we're going to get with Ultra HD.
And finally, but not least, Nick Colsey from Sony.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Nick Colsey, Business Development for Sony Electronics. So focusing primarily on smart TVs and Sony's 4K strategy, including HDR. Very excited to be talking about picture quality. That's the #1 reason that people buy TVs. So very important part of the TV buying equation. And HDR and 4K, of course, are key enablers for that improved picture quality. We talk about HDR and 4K as being new and some say future technologies, but really this is here and now, today. So we've been selling 4K TVs since 2012 and had 4K content offerings to go with those also since 2012. So this is now something that's maturing. The majority of premium TVs that are sold in the market, not just from Sony, but our competitors as well, are now 4K. You go into a Best Buy and you will see a vast range of 4K TVs at different screen sizes, mostly far below 70 inches actually, and producing tremendous experience and difference versus their HD counterparts. So this is a rapidly growing market, 5 times increase versus last year, for example, in the number of 4K TVs that were sold. And HDR, although it's a new terminology to many people, again, it's here and it's now. We have HDR, 4K HDR content from Amazon playing on our, streaming to our 4K TVs today, starting from $1,500 upwards. This is not something that's out of reach for the average TV buyer.
Thank you, Nick. We intentionally want to make this as interactive as possible because one of the very reasons why we formed this group was to advance the conversation about all the different parameters that make Ultra HD work. It's not just spatial resolution, as we heard. It's all manner of other things. So one of the things I would like to ask the panel, I've got my own questions first, but please put your hand up, and then what I'll do in the interest of the video is I will repeat your question back. But before you have any questions, I would like to ask one which I think is crucially important. By the year 2020, we expect that over 50% of US households will have a 4K capable television. How many of those TVs do you think, I'm going to address this to you, Nick, and to you, Richard, to start with. How many of those 4K TVs will regularly be consuming content that has these richer features of higher dynamic range, wider color depths and things like that? What's your thoughts on that, Nick?
Oh yeah, the vast majority of them. In fact, I was asked a similar question, but not in the context of the year 2020, but in the context of the year 2016, spring next year. So if you look at the increase, 5 times as many 4K TVs sold this year as last year, we're building up an installed base of 4K TVs that are primarily very new, most sold within the last 6 to 9 months. The vast majority of those TVs have been, not just from Sony, but from others as well, have been upgraded to support HDR. So, and with HDR, as the CTA has defined it, comes 2020 as well, the new wider color gamut. So we already see, I think by spring of next year, the majority of 4K TVs as having these advanced capabilities.
Yeah, I would concur. The number of 4K only TVs, I think, is going to diminish. It already is. We've already announcements from Sony, from Samsung, kind of from LG, that all their televisions moving forward are going to be HDR capable as well. So I think the 4K only, the ones that are only doing resolution, are pretty much already legacy devices, if you can believe that. There was this eight-month window in which they came out. The interesting thing, though, is we know the jump to 4K, what that looks like. The jump to HDR, the jump to wide color gamut, that's sort of a harder to define thing, a more incremental thing. It's something the UHD forum, I think, is very much addressing. Because turns out to do high dynamic range, you have to have a bright TV, and to make a bright TV is new technology is very difficult. So we measure televisions by something called a nit, which is a candela per meter squared, how bright it gets, and those brightness numbers keep increasing over time as they determine new technologies. Same for color space. We have Rec 2020, but no consumer television right now can show that whole color space. Right now they're limited to something in the middle called kind of P3, which is related to cinema. So there's a lot of work. TVs are going to continue to get better, and there's a lot of space for them to do so over the next 5 to 6 years, absolutely.
So I'm going to come to you then, Thomas, because you've said you've got a lot of content coming out. Is it coming out at 400 nits, 1,000 nits? What's it going to come out when it's released to the home? And is it going to be 2020?
Well, I can't speak for 20th Century Fox on this particular element, but I suspect that most of what they have will be peaking above 1,000 nits. Certainly content that I've seen from them, and we've seen on our own Samsung HDR display on our lab, has highlights above 1,000 nits. And I think practically what we're seeing in televisions right now is that they're limited to about 1,100 nits. There are issues like Energy Star compliance, which we start to run into. I mean, you can drive these televisions really bright, but then you start running up against power consumption issues. So I think that we're going to see somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 nits in the short term. It may take some revolutions in television technology to push beyond 2,000 nits. But I tell you, 1,100 nits looks awesome. You watch Life of Pi, there's a scene where there are 1,000 candles floating in a pond, and it's just incredibly beautiful. There are scenes where the sun is shooting down, it's really bright, specular highlights. High dynamic range looks really cool, at least in theatrically lit productions. Whether it works super well for all sports is still something that we're actively exploring. But for theatrically lit content, HDR is great. And I tell you, we may see HDR on 1080p as well. You don't necessarily have to have HDR only on 4K for television purposes. For television purposes, we may choose to put it on something like 1080p 60, or maybe even up the frame rate to 1080p 120 with high dynamic range.
And I just want to jump in. We did some, Dolby did some research, which you can look up on SMPTE, which was about how bright does a TV have to get to satisfy viewers in terms of an excellent picture. We actually showed people all the way up to 10,000 nits, so there's a lot of room for growth. And just for context, the sun, if you stare into the sun, don't do that. If you stare into the sun, that is 1.3 billion nits. So, and so you can't look in the sun, but you can look into hundreds and hundreds of thousands of nits in real life. So still, the difference between what you can see in a display and what you can see when you just walk outside is enormous.
And by the way, living in the Bay Area, I could always tell when they're demonstrating it because my lights went dim every time. Eric, is there going to be an orderly phasing of this over the next few years? And what's it looking like?
Well, there's a few things, right? So when we're talking about internet distribution and internet speeds, you can do things almost right away, right? So there's going to be experiments with, not experiments, real production systems with different over-the-top services that are doing HDR and other things right away. When it talks about sort of a big step function up for a broadcast, that's going to take a little bit longer. And in fact, broadcast is really struggling, I think, with how quickly it can adopt all these new technologies at what cost. And so I think we're seeing in sports, they really want, actually HDR does look good in sports. We've played with it, and it's like, actually HDR works to make a great picture in almost every context. And so we're seeing that that's highly desired, and more TVs are coming out that will support this. But you need the right distribution, enough devices to be able to pull this off. And so right now it's only internet distribution that's probably at the forefront of that. We're just starting to see the equipment is actually capable of actually doing this and actually making the distribution. So it's just at the beginning parts of the full live events to do this. We're seeing more offline content being able to do HDR. So I think it's coming pretty quickly, and we'll see internet speed versus broadcast speed will be a pretty big contrast.
Please make sure you're ready with questions, but I've still got loads more, but don't be shy. Nick, one of the things that's interesting, I think Thomas touched on it, there is going to be some places where, for bandwidth reasons or other reasons, 1080p with HDR is going to be what's delivered. Is the upscaling in the televisions today going to really do justice to the 4K content, or is it going to be somewhat artificial looking?
Yeah, so upscaling is one of the ways that TV manufacturers add their special sauce, because the way that upscaling works is, it's something that's taking place between the decoding of the video stream and the display itself. So it's a purely internal function of the TV, and clearly some upscalers are better than others. We like to think that our upscaling is the best. It upscales everything that you watch on TV, from every input, from YouTube, everything is upscaled to 4K. Always has been on all Sony 4K TVs. So yeah, that's certainly something that that we specialize in, and we've done side-by-side tests of content that's been upscaled by video aggregators, OVPs, who've decided to kind of experiment with that. So using the resources of the cloud and vast server farms to use the very best upscaling algorithms. Putting that side by side with what a Sony TV can do on a 1080p source, we think we come out better.
I want to make one point on that too. Think about adaptive bitrate streaming. You're going to be switching resolutions potentially, and for us to support a live event and being able to have it switch down maybe to 1080 from 2160p is probably a very likely thing with network congestion. You want to give somebody a headache, switch from SDR to HDR back and forth all the time. It's not going to work, right? So there's definitely a path for doing a 1080p HDR signal, at least an encode of it, so you can handle adaptive bitrate streaming to do live events through the internet.
So in the streaming world, which we're at the center of right here, one of the things that's possible is that the things like gamma, EOTF, what do you like to call it, these things can be downloaded on the fly. Will we see that happening in the sets themselves, the ability to change their configuration, both in terms of what's coming down from the content source, but also in terms of maybe simple things like the ambient light source that's surrounding it? What do you think?
Well, there's a lot of parameters that go into the television display and actually the pixels that happen. Well, that's a lot of, I would like to say, HDR is kind of like this big mountain, and there's a lot of things that help you get up the mountain, but sort of the biggest work that has to be done is by the display manufacturers. They have to deal with the physics of making the pixels work and those power consumption issues. So some of the signaling that we talk about in EOTFs, those are important pieces, but getting those pixels to really do the right thing is still a lot of work. And so some updates will be able to be, or some things will be able to be updatable and tunable even after the sets have been deployed on some of these things. Something like an EOTF is just a function curve. It's actually not that complicated of math, but actually doing the final mapping to those it does take some effort on the display manufacturers. So some things may be able to be updated. So that's, but it's still, there's a lot of work to be done in the actual display physics to make a really good, bright and HDR response display.
Should we define electro-optic transfer function?
Yeah.
Go on, do it.
Okay.
EOTF, yeah.
See if I can do this in 30 seconds. Electro-optic transfer function is what goes between a code value in a pixel, let's say the pixel is 128, and how much brightness comes out of that actual pixel. Up till now, because of the CRT legacy of television, we use something called a curve called gamma. And I won't go into the mathematical details, but basically it was what a tube television receiving device and a tube television display device would do naturally because of the physics of electrons. We're now done with cathode ray tubes. We now can do all kinds of things in an LED-backed LCD display or in a OLED display. So we can now use these electro-optic transfer functions that get us a higher amount of dynamic range, and that basically means the brightest brights can be brighter, the darkest darks can be darker, and more specifically, as you go from one code value to another, you don't see the difference in your eye. You don't get banding on the screen as you go from, let's say, 128 to 129. And you have to come up with a very specific curve to make sure that banding doesn't show up and have it all fit into our standard 10-bit production space. So hopefully that explains what
and maybe
EOTF is.
one quick preface to that too. This all is because things are digital. and it's the number of bits you can allocate to something. And so if we could allocate 16 bits per color space per pixel, we wouldn't actually even have this problem.
Yeah, we'd be linear light.
It would be linear light
yeah.
curve, which would be really simple. But because we're trying to cram stuff into 10, 12 bits, 10 bits, 8 bits, actually 8 bits is not enough to do this right, which is part of the issue. So we have to go up to 10. How do you cram that 10 bits into that distribution curve of light? And so all of this is about how to cram that in there. So it's really just, it's a math function of how do you cram, 10,000 levels of brightness into 10 bits of data. And so that's really one of the essence of
But it's
also
a function that came about through 10 years of research on the human optic system.
Yeah.
Well, we've got two of them now.
There are
We've
two.
got SMPTE 2084 perceptual quantizer, and we also have a hybrid log gamma. There's a big cage match now going on about which one of these is more appropriate. One appears to be more backwards compatible when displayed on standard dynamic range sets. One is less, but there are pros and cons, and the industry is still trying to work this out.
Interesting that Japan, Arab, I guess, have adopted hybrid log gamma. Anyway, all this, by the way, there will be a test at the end of this, and if you get less than 70%, you will not be allowed at the bar. Anyway, I got a question. We talked about cathode ray tubes and moving on to LED, LCD. What is the role of quantum dot technology in having displays that can really take the artistic intention that Thomas has tried to bring through 1,000+ nits, etc.? Or is there alternatives? Does OLED have any legs, or is it limited by the fact that it degrades over time? That's a Nick question.
Well, yeah, I'm not the best person to answer that because we don't sell OLED TVs and we don't sell quantum dot TVs either. I mean, these are two solutions to the problem of delivering the best possible picture quality at prices customers can afford. But I should say we do sell OLED TVs in our professional range for use in production systems, but we don't sell OLED consumer TVs.
I'll say that I've heard OLED manufacturers say they will have high dynamic range sets. Just what their peak brightness will be is kind of TBD, but it'll be higher than 100 nits, which is your standard CRT mastering level.
The interesting thing about OLEDs is they get darker. And so the dynamic range is actually the difference between the darkest you can show and the brightest. And OLEDs can get a lot darker than LCD TVs. I'm just generalizing, but that's often a big...
If you turn on all the lights off in your room, they can definitely get really dark.
There is a beautiful Sony reference monitor that I love it. It's only 30 inches. It has almost perfect linear response through all these brightnesses. Goes to 1,000 nits, does 20/20 color space. It's like, wow, it checks off all the boxes. But it's $40,000, so, or something about that price. So those kind of things are not mainstream, and it's actually going to take the industry time to catch up, because Nick made that point for having it to be inexpensive and mainstream pricing. Someday we hopefully will have 100-inch displays that can do all those characteristics and check off the boxes and cost $1,000. But we're actually a little ways away from that, unfortunately. Oh,
We have a question from the floor. Could you introduce yourself as well, please?
Sure.
Yeah, I think we should.
That's a great question. Well, one question is, I think we even had this question beforehand when we had our discussion, is how much does it cost to actually add some of these things? And actually, it's kind of opposite of maybe what you might expect. Is resolution cost the most, and something like HDR can cost the least. In fact, there's not a huge bit rate increase when you go to HDR, and then frame rate is not quite linear, but can be in some places, but it is going to require, I'll just say it this way, it is going to require more bandwidth to support higher quality. It will. But it's maybe not quite as linear as you'd expect, and we're not talking about 100 megabit per second signals to do this. You can do quite a bit in the 20 range, 15 range for even up to 60. We did 4K 60p in the 15 megabit per second range on some sports stuff, and it actually looked pretty good. It wasn't HDR. It would require a little bit more to do that, but I think it's definitely possible to do that, and that's why also I brought up the point about going down to lower resolutions for adaptive bitrate streaming to make a nice smooth transition as we're going to get into higher quality with realistic internet speeds.
Let's be clear. 4K really demands HEVC coding.
Yeah,
There's really it's not really practical to deliver 4K resolution content with H.264. So that is the one issue. Obviously, HEVC is a more computationally complex codec. It means new equipment. There's some licensing issues which are either odd or not yet determined, which we can leave for another panel.
Right?
Yeah.
Was your question about delivery or about content preparation, or about capture and acquisition?
It was really about emission encoding and delivery.
Yeah, because it's, I mean, we talked about the bandwidth issues, and Eric certainly nailed that in terms of how different they can be. But in terms of content preparation, that's a whole different ballgame, right? 4K, we think we know how to do it, but very, very few movies are captured in 4K, and those that are often have visual effects that are not done in 4K. And so there's upraising that happens either entirely or partially on the highest premium capture that we do. But most productions are capturing high dynamic range. Film can capture 14 stops of dynamic range, right? You probably know this very well. So certainly the red cameras that are capturing can capture significant amounts of dynamic range. So it's all about SMPTE and getting the infrastructure correctly to make sure they capture it. But then there's this question about nits that came up. Well, when you do your color timing, how bright do you make your picture? That's a big question. It's a question for your HDF to solve, a question for your HDA to solve. What's the right point that you protect yourself in the future from these TVs that might appear versus squashing the signal and making something that's not as beautiful as it can be. And right now, there's a lot, I think I would characterize a lot of dissension. I don't know what Fox is doing. I believe they're putting out 1,000 nit productions for Vidity, but I believe a lot of other studios are archiving at 4,000 nit peak brightness. As something they picked out. And there's a lot of technologies from Dolby, from Technicolor, that help you take that and then sort of shrink that dynamic range to be correct for whatever end device that you're shooting for. But the industry is very much in flux, so it's a big problem.
Yeah, the good news, the cameras are there.
Yeah.
You can buy, for instance, a Sony F55, for instance. You can buy 4K cameras, it's no problem. You can record either an S-Log to get high dynamic range or even RAW to get even more high dynamic range. So the production part of it, especially for film material, is fairly easy to do. There's a little bit more challenge in moving 4K uncompressed inside the broadcast plant. It requires some tweaks, although as we move to an Ethernet-based live production system, we'll be able to ride on 25 gigabit Ethernet and that'll make our life a little bit easier. And then on the distribution side, there are plenty of 4K sets out there, but we need 4K set-top boxes and we need 4K encoders for HEVC.
Good question. Just one last thing on that, and the Ericsson research folks found that their actual move from 8-bit to 10-bit did not significantly increase bandwidth whatsoever, because now you're actually reducing the errors, making the compression algorithms more effective, so it actually compensated. So is there a question there?
Yeah. I don't know if this is something that you're looking at in the task force, but my question is about the DRM, and what's your view on like if there's going to be a consensus of like what's going to be software protected by a software DRM or by a hardware DRM, and if you see any need of like evolution in that, and if like it's kind of a
Good question.
exactly on.
We've got two gentlemen in the middle here who got the content, so I'm going to address it to them, because presumably this 4K HEVC experience is going to contain more valuable content.
Well, I will say on the 20th Century Fox side, they're distributing through Vidity, which is the consumer brand of the Secure Content Storage Association, which involves secure hardware solutions. So that's one of the reasons they feel safe about putting out this incredibly high quality version of this movie and sending it out to people as a digital file. Otherwise, they'd be concerned. And then on the Ultra HD Blu-ray side, they also have a very high level of security. So that's been built into the feature film material, which we're putting out in UHD.
Yeah, I'd say the forum itself is actually looked at not tackling the DRM side, but maybe looking more about interoperability. Things like common encryption and making sure that flows through the system is actually very important. Robustness rules that go into systems are kind of a different thing. But yes, I mean, exactly. Vidity has a set of robustness rules, that are very strict for 4K content, as you'd expect. Also, AACS 2.0 also describes robustness rules and the way security can work. So there's going to be increasing security. We see a spectrum. Some live events, they don't even bother encrypting it. Once it's over, no one cares. Maybe it's more about redistribution is the issue. For things that are going to be more longevity, there is definitely, let's make sure this is very robust and things that are put into it. But I think the studios and different, like I said, consortiums are helped define those robustness rules and what needs to be done. And in terms of forensic marking as well. So I mean, there's a whole spectrum of what you can do in security. It's pretty broad.
Good question. So yes, please.
This is more on the transport side. So for through a quad pipe, which can be at most 37 point something megabits per second. So what do you think is the reasonable range, one for sport and the other one for transactional VOD or subscription VOD?
So the question here was about the constraint of the cable QAM plant, right?
Without HEVC.
Without HEVC. Okay.
Without HEVC or with HEVC?
Without.
Without
Without?
HEVC.
No
Ooh,
hope.
that's going to be really tough
No.
in that constraint.
It's got to be HEVC to fit into that kind of bit rate. And,
For
and
4K.
For 4K resolution, yeah.
So what would be the range? Because you can deliver higher than 38 through Doctor High, which is over the top.
Well, the Edwards law of compression is you can always save some bits and make it look like crap, okay? And clearly people do that on a regular basis, don't get me wrong. We feel 30 megabits per second is a good floor, especially for live encoded content. We think 30 megabits per second is a good floor now. And I'm sure that as Ericsson and others improve their encoding quality, they'll be able to bring that down. The experts I talk to say we might get to maybe 20 megabits per second. You know, give it 5 years. But right now, we'd be happy with 30. But there are people who make very different aesthetic decisions than that.
That's HEVC,
Yeah, I mean-
right?
HEVC, yeah.
HEVC.
Yeah, yes.
So it's still doable
With HEVC.
with it.
Yes, that's HEVC coding, yeah, not H.264.
But if you do basic math for ABC, right now, if you think 8 megabits per second is okay, like Netflix does, then at a maximum, it's 4 times that. So if you get
We'll
max,
say it's 8 times that, because you've got, just the way it works, it's 8 times, yeah. Because it's either interlaced, if it's 1080i, that's interlaced.
it's all progressive on Netflix.
Yeah, but I'm saying if it's, anyway.
All right, 24 frames per
There.
second material. It's less than 4 times, so you can do 36 megabits per second.
Yeah.
If Netflix quality is okay for you.
So
Wait.
we basically, are we making a bet based on the success rate of HEVC?
The whole industry is going to be
Yeah,
relying
so-
on
I
HEVC,
mean,
but
how
not
do-
just for...
Costings around 2017 roughly.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're saying is HEVC or some other advanced codec that's just as good as HEVC is required to make this work. That's our
I
viewpoint.
would
We're still
say
looking.
100% of 4K televisions are shipping with HEVC decoders right now.
Yeah, I was just going to make that point. I mean, we build HEVC encoders in software, right? And we're seeing some great improvements. We build state-of-the-art encoders, and we're getting better and better bit rates, as Thomas said, and Ericsson and other people who build encoders. We're getting better and better performance. HEVC is approaching more maturity. There was just a session before that talked about the state of HEVC, and it's not 100% one way or the other. It's not all rosy because there's some licensed things and there's still some optimizations, but it actually is. There's a good wave of momentum coming with HEVC, and it's in a lot of devices, and it's a lot of the devices that we're going to care about that are doing the highest quality that generally have HEVC in them. It's getting to be in mobile devices. Like I said, the technology's out there. There is going to be some uptick in adoption, but it's needed to do this better experience.
Yeah, it'll be an Ultra HD Blu-ray. So.
It'll be an Ultra HD Blu-rays, exactly that too.
Yeah, and
Question-
it may not. Yeah, it's in all of our TVs. It may not be in any cable systems yet, but it's in DirecTV. I mean, that's what is being delivered using the RView technology straight into TVs from around the home network.
And that's up to 60p too.
That's all HEVC 60p. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, the question right here.
I got 2 questions. My name is Harry. So the first question is Epic Dash we are hearing about. Is that going to be scaling well with 4K, or do you see any issues with Epic Dash? The second question is VP9 going to be one of the codecs? Because we hear that YouTube is going to apply this 4K free license VP9. We're going to not be with HEVC going forward in the next few years.
Okay, so to repeat to the camera then, the questions, 2 questions. One is the interface basically and how it works, interoperates with MPEG-Dash. Second one is VP9, a viable alternative codec to HEVC. So, who wants to do Dash? Someone? Oh, we've got Will Law.
We're in the Dash Industry Forum and attend a lot of meetings there. And we actually have Dash solutions in our products now. When you get our kits, they come with Dash. We're supporting Dash. We do HLS and other things too. But I mean, Dash is a nice interoperability specification. It solves a lot of problems. It will scale just fine for ultra high def. In fact, aren't you doing a I mean,
Yeah.
Richard does a task force for this in Dash. So I mean, it's definitely a focus there. So that's, yeah, Dash is, I think, a pretty good, things definitely going to be moving more and more to MPEG Dash, and we're seeing that especially on Android and other systems where it's just, that's what it's going to be using.
In fact, to be clear, it's a great solution for ultra-high def, because as you mentioned before, you can scale from 4K to 1080. It's designed to do that. It does that right now. Dash Industry Forum, very focused in interoperability for these solutions, so we're seeing a lot of support for that moving forward for those technologies.
Yeah, we were one of the founders of that. Will, do you want to describe what you're doing with 4K in Dash? I heard there was a work stream inside the Dash Industry Forum specifically on that.
I am the chair of the group, which if you came to the meetings.
I can't. I've got this one now. It's sort of taking my time.
I do have a question for you, actually.
Yeah.
But can we answer, keep that one? The second question is important, VP9.
Yeah, if you want to support YouTube 4K in your device, in our case, TVs, you have to support VP9. Because that's what YouTube 4K comes in.
Yeah, there are differences of opinion as to the realizable quality of VP9 versus HEVC. I think there are a lot of people in the industry who feel that HEVC is at least slightly better than VP9. In some cases, it just is a matter of who's making, how many people are making the encoders and how many eyeballs are going into the artwork of figuring out how to squeeze those bits out using the tool set that's in HEVC versus the tool set of VP9.
Check the licensing terms in both, just a caveat.
Yes, a good idea as well.
The question, Will, what was that?
Yes, just a question. So UHD Forum is driving towards interop and a faster interop of UHD. And the main divergence today is around hybrid log gamma and EQ on the HDR side. So how's the UHD Forum attacking this? Are you going to pick a favorite, or are you going to wait? And if so, how long is the wait, and who's making the decision? I understand TVs can support both, but as an encoder, you're not going to encode two sets of content. So what's the way forward here?
Yeah, if I can answer that, and then you can correct
Sure.
me. We're basically looking at three phases of this forum. The first one was the formative phase, which is just trying to get it off the ground, right, and getting the membership you see there. The second phase we're in now is the informative phase, where we're actually going to be continuing to try to accelerate the conversation about this. We're outreaching to Arab, we're outreaching to DVB, BU, everybody you can think of, trying to accelerate, A, the amount of understanding and common knowledge there is about what's good and not so good, and then B, trying to form a consensus. And then at the end of the day, we have a guidelines document being prepared, which in the third phase of this is going to come out, I think, in the new year. I can't say whether Nandu from LG is driving this, but certainly that's where we actually start defining what we consider best industry practice. Whether it be the 0.1 to 1,000 nits or whatever it is. And then finally, after that, the very fourth phase of it is where we start getting interoperability rounds, of which Eric is the chair of the interop working group inside UHD Forum. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty good. I think the notion of picking sides on this one is a little bit of not quite right framing for the Ultra HD Forum. If it's relevant Ultra HD technology, we're going to be looking at it and put it in our own framing of what it is. I mean, hybrid log gamma has certain advantages and benefits. PQ has certain advantages and benefits. I think the fact that there's confusion in that is a problem that the forum can help solve, actually, to put things into context, because we have different people saying, oh, it's not a religious war. They're both electro-optical transfer functions, which, like I said, that goes over people's heads really fast. But it's part of the technology that's getting us a better picture. And there's actually, when we talk about the end-to-end issues of actually delivering Ultra HD through the whole thing, there's lots of challenges there. And so the forum's going to help guide people in that end-to-end entire framework to making it work. So I wouldn't say, it would be, if you're going to go with hybrid log gamma, here's a best practice for doing it. If you're going with PQ, here's a best practice for doing it. Here's how the signaling works. For example, PQ is inside of SMPTE 2086 metadata, and then there's CEA 863 or 861.3 that has a reserved bit that could actually add hybrid log gamma. It's just a simple bit flag. Some of these things, making sure that those work, is actually some of the things that we're going to be tackling as the forum. So don't look for a certification plan from us. Don't look for an endorsement of one thing's over another per se, but look more of a, how do you make this work on an end-to-end
Yeah, as a
solution?
user in the forum, I have a suspicion that we will not come to consensus on this particular issue, at least in the next 6 months. I think PQ has had a lot of research behind it, especially from Dolby, and we appreciate that, and it works pretty well. We're developing content with it today. Hybrid log gamma kind of came out of left field, and it's something that not everybody has seen yet, not everybody's fully examined. It has very interesting properties of potentially being backwards compatible with standard dynamic range sets. I think it's got to prove that out. But overall, it might come down to a situation where we've got 2 electro-optic transfer functions for 2 different use cases, and we're just going to have to make sure that all of the glue between the camera and the display can carry that. And I think that's what the best thing the forum can do.
Yeah, good question. Yes?
So just want to be clear. So if the content prepared with, say, Dolby Vision, do I need the TV with Dolby Vision in there to get something back?
Do you need a QA?
No.
Sorry.
So if the content is prepared by Dolby Vision for the HDR,
Mhm.
do I need the Dolby Vision TV to play that content back?
The Dolby Vision technology is both a workflow and an end device certification, a logo program like an audio codec. So the Dolby Vision workflow is how you set up the content and shoot it in Dolby Vision, prepare it. And then out of that workflow can come both a version that's compatible for Dolby Vision televisions and also a version that's compatible for HDR televisions that is not. So one of the things we try to sell is that we can help you prepare your HDR content for any end device, whether it's Dolby Vision or not. If it's a Dolby Vision television, you will get better quality. That's what we're claiming, and I can give you the background for that, because it's 12 bits rather than 10. But you will also get really good quality for an HDR 10-bit TV as well, and it's an integrated solution. It's part of the branding, part of the certification solution. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Questions? Okay, I'd like to ask you if you think that titles coming out of studios in the next 12 months are going to really address this, and whether CES is going to force the hand of the studios and make everybody catch up, including us as the industry forum, or do you think everyone's going to hold back and wait? Like HD, do you remember HD? There was thousands of millions of HD sets out there, but no HD content.
Well, I can say, 20th Century Fox, and I know now Sony Pictures will be releasing an Ultra HD Blu-ray. So, from our film side, everything's, gung-ho, let's go for it. On the television side, we have to see how the business models work. And frankly, we're not going to be driven by the Consumer Electronics Association. We saw what happened with stereoscopic 3D. We're not going to repeat that. We're going to be cautious. We're going to make sure the business models are in place. We have to watch channel cannibalization, especially as we have HD broadcasts where we still have 30 million people watching on a Sunday. We can't just go around our broadcast affiliates to an MVPD and offer a competing product of the same game, right? So there are going to be a lot of business elements that have to fall into place for this to make sense. But it will make sense. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, it's already happening today. So you can go to Amazon and watch a Sony Pictures movie in HDR and do that through your Sony TV and other TVs as well. So this is happening here and now today.
Also, the studios are being smart about how they're mastering things, and as we said, the cameras have all this in it, so the source signal's there, the raw is there, and hopefully there's more attention now to archiving some of those original source. Even the film does much better than how it ends up on a lot of distribution, digital distribution. So I think as long as that big source is there, it can be redistributed over time into different formats and what makes sense. And so I think the amount of content that's going to, the expense to actually get it out there and whatever the intermediary it's going to be, there is some cost there. And so there's going to be some business trade-offs about what people are going to spend, the studios are going to spend, and business are going to spend to see if it's worth it. So there is going to be some dynamics of that going on.
One question that I often get asked is that despite HEVC's mitigation, are we driving everyone now to start hitting data caps on all the services that they're going to get? Is this just another example of pushing them into the fold so that they can get revenue from an alternative source?
I think everybody's pretty focused on making the picture better and making the consumer experience better, and not just sort of trying to make.
Yeah, hopefully there aren't data caps in home broadband connections. I mean, does anybody here have a data cap on their home broadband
Everybody
connection?
in Comcast has
Or
a
do
data
you
cap.
even know?
Everyone in Time Warner has a data cap. They just haven't been enforced yet.
You can still watch Fox Sports 1.
There's a question right there.
Over what connection? Sorry, there's a question. Thank you.
Hi. So, simple two-part question following on Eric's earlier comment about adaptive streaming. One, will there be HDR content on smaller screens and sub 4K resolution? One, and two, what the heck will that be called? Will that be called UHD? What is this conflation of UHD with 4K seems to have gone so deep into the consumer mindset that I don't know how you ever untangle it now. So how do you do HDR on smaller screens and sub 4K resolution, and what do you call that?
Well, so first I think there will be, because of adaptive streaming, just because it makes sense. And there will be smaller screens that mobile screens that'll be doing HDR because the quality of the picture looks so good. That's the reason there's so much excitement about HDR, is because it just makes every picture look better. So it's going to be a powerful way. In fact, most TVs, they always had these, when you go to the TV store, the brightest TVs are the ones that tend to sell. They have special demo store vivid modes that crank up the brightness. This is actually just a more intelligent, HDR is a more intelligent way to use that brightness and actually not wash out things, but keep everything, black's black and still make the brights bright. So HDR is going to be powerful in a lot of places. I think because the technology is getting better, you'll see HDR in not necessarily always coupled with 4K. I think that's going to happen. I guess the second part of your question was, say that again?
What do you call it?
What do you call it? See, that's the catch. I think the branding of this is part of the problem. I would characterize, this is once again internet mentality versus broadcast mentality. Broadcast is like, what's this single line signal that I get, and I just want to have it be this one signal. We'd all be happy like it was in the good old days kind of thing. Internet, it's like, wow, we're doing 20 different encodes with multiple quality levels, and we're switching between them, and no one knows, and just we're not sure what to call it. It's just whatever. It's the best quality picture you can get for the device you have, the internet connection you have, and so it's hard to brand it as it's just better, right? And I think what we're seeing in the internet services, they actually struggle to even call it that. Netflix was calling their thing, I think, they were calling HD, and it was 720 at one point. Now they're calling it, Super HD and all these different terms, and that. It's Dolby, and then there's Dolby Vision, right? So there's lots of different terms that are used, and it is complicated. And I think we've seen the branding and all this is really tricky because 4K UHD. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a can of worms.
We addressed this recently in an internal Ultra HD forum meeting that recognized that conflation of terms. The HDR10, HDR Plus, for instance, is one that a lot of the industry is now using to denote HDR with wide color gamut and 10-bit color volume. So that is an issue that we will resolve. And in addition to a guidelines document, we're actually coming out with an Ultra HD forum glossary, which I hope will be widely adopted by all the members that you saw up there, and hopefully by the industry. But it's going to be between now and CES where that comes out.
There's one more use case for 1080p HDR, and that's the ATSC 3.0, the next generation digital television standard in ATSC countries, which will give us about 24 megabits per second with our equivalent single stick per city coverage, which we could kind of do a 4K signal on, or we could do a bunch, at least 2, maybe 3, 1080p 60 HDR signals on. So it's being talked about a lot with regards to ATSC 3.0 use cases.
And I just want to mention for the small screen, like iPads, Retina displays have a very significant dynamic range because they're meant to be read out in daylight. And the computer interface they use uses significantly more dynamic range than the video content. And so the displays are there. So being able to leverage them with the artistic intent is something that, it's a great application for 1080p HDR.
We've got time for about 2 more questions. So If you've got one, don't hold back, because this is the time you've got the opportunity to do that. Sorry, yeah.
So on the distribution side, what are mezzanine file sizes looking like for BOD as you go into the transactional BOD world? Are they 500 gigabytes, 1 terabyte distribution? The distributors?
For UHD, yeah, I don't think we've even got to that point of calculating that. I have a suspicion that we might just send a highly compressed version directly. We might not have a mezzanine version.
You mentioned JPEG 2000 earlier on.
Yeah, JPEG 2000 is still my favorite codec. The intellectual property is well understood. It does a good job of compression, but
And
we'll see.
50 to 100 megabits per kind of mezzanine.
Yeah, you could definitely, at the digital cinema package level of about 250 megabits per second, you can definitely do 4K just fine.
There's the EMEA mezzanine standard that came from Google and some others worked on that, and that's 50 megabits per second MPEG-2, or 50 megabits per second AVC as well is now allowed. And you would, I think they have a 4K version. I think it goes up to 100 or 120 megabits per second. So 2x, 2.5x.
Good question. Any others? Yes, one more.
What's the current expected availability schedule for the Ultra HD Blu-ray players and titles? Are there going to be anything by Christmas, or is it
I've been told Christmas time, but
okay.
but I would suggest you read the press on that one.
Go to CES.
Remember, I'm a television guy, so sorry. I can't speak authoritatively for the other side of the
CES
line.
this year is going to be fascinating in this space for sure. Do you ever, final question I get, do you ever see a time where the color decision list that is made at the time of production is somehow transformed into metadata that goes all the way to the display, so that the true artistic rendering, no matter what the light conditions are, et cetera, is going to be optimized in the viewer's eye?
Boy, what a great softball question. So the answer is absolutely. That's one of the key things that we have to solve. And there's a number of SMPTE groups trying to solve the metadata issue to preserve them on the mezzanine. And again, I have to mention Dolby Vision. When you have a cinematic title in Dolby Vision, that metadata is taken from cinema all the way down to the home. And that's sort of one of the advantages, is that metadata all the way to the screen. And so the idea here is not necessarily to make better HDR pictures. The idea is to preserve the artistic intent. And that's really a key that everyone tries to preserve, whether it's HDR, Dolby Vision, or whatever, is by carrying that metadata, you want the screen to look exactly like the artist wanted it to look like. And that's really key. Because otherwise you get vivid mode where everything's blown out. It doesn't look at all like what you want it to look like.
Well, and you also have some fun things with live content where you have less, you have a guy with a camera and tune up some things. And so that can also help in those kind of situations. But we're definitely looking at live, and the job of a colorist used to be you had this big range, you had to squish it down to this. Well, now you can, you have this much room. There's actually a lot of room for mistakes in that too, as well. So it actually gives you more room to sort of hang yourself in some of these pictures when you have this bigger range. So I do think having the right kind of metadata in the right places can actually help a lot. So I think, like I said, a lot's happening in SMPTE right now to help figure this out. So I do expect that that's going to happen.
Okay, so amazing. We've done almost an hour without talking about audio, and Dolby's here. So, but that's for another day, because I wanted to show you just some events. That was last week in CCW. We had Matthew Goldman, who many of you probably know from Ericsson, running Ultra HD Forum panel there. We have a webinar coming up on November 24th. So while you're getting the turkey ready, that's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving next week, you can get on through VideoNet. It's actually going to be on 24 distributing it, and it's moderated by Barry Flynn. It's going to be very, very popular. Already it's got over 200 people planning to attend it. At CES, there's some interesting things going on. In addition to all the other stuff we mentioned, we've got the Inter-SDO meeting. This is where the standard-defining organizations get together and hopefully come to some form of agreements to accelerate this. We have a face-to-face forum meeting on that January 5th, and then there's an alliance of alliance events on 7th. Mark your calendar for the event that we've got coming up at NAB, jointly with the Dash Industry Forum. We're going to set the place on fire at Caesar's Palace on the 20th evening. And there's also a masterclass planned on that Tuesday, the prior day. Anyway, with that, I'd like to thank the panel. Great job, guys, and thank you for coming.